Then I floop the pig.
What?
What?
Okay.
I am replicating CardWars from Adventure Time into an actually playable game. Don't worry if you haven't watched the other videos, I'll do a recap on what's relevant. We have a playtest currently available in Tabletop Simulator with a mixed bag of placeholder cards. Unlike other card games, there's a board between the players with elemental land cards that define the individual lands you own and their abilities. Last time I talked about stuff related to the economy systems, but that isn't important right now. What is important is that I touched on the introduction of elemental land cards, but it was hard to be definite about their functions without some specific ones to test. But now, after creating the first real deck, I have them, which is a really big look at how the game will actually play in a more complete version down the line. This first deck is for the doors element, which I figured was fitting because it was the first community voted element, and I also had some cool ideas for it, so it worked out. There are actually already 2 door-themed cards in the messy pile of playtest cards that I made. Their abilities both play off of adjacency, so that was my starting point for the element overall. I plan on starting with 4 elemental decks and have notes written up for what each of their game plans will be and what sort of mechanics they will use. When I was looking at them together, adjacency as a main concept for the door element just wasn't really a full idea. I really like the concept, it plays around with the board itself, which is something I'd really like to incorporate as much as possible, since it's something other card games don't have. But as I said, making lands adjacent and not adjacent isn't enough to center an entire playstyle around. Teleporting with doors was an obvious option, but I already had plans for lizard holes to revolve around teleporting, so I don't know. When designing things like this, my favorite approach has always been to take mechanics already in place, like adjacency, combat, moving, drawing cards, stuff like that, then twist and pull it as far as it can possibly go instead of layering more and more things onto the game. But man, I tied myself down to that like a rock without noticing the rock was at the bottom of a lake. I needed to keep my mind open to craft elements with real strategic depth, so I introduced a card that the element would center around. Door. Honestly, if you're surprised by that, I can't help you. Okay, so the element's primary playstyle will center around placing and using these doors, and have many cards that create them or base their abilities on them. The doors themselves have 2 main functions. The first is that you can essentially destroy a door to move a creature at it to another land with a door. And the other is that if a creature of yours were to take damage at a door, it can instead escape through it, which also destroys it. Adjacency is still being exploited in the deck, but it's more of a supplemental mechanic. The game plan form here revolves around hit and run tactics using the doors, sacrificing your doors for other things like these creatures, which come from the door dimension known as the vault, and strong but slow units that require use of the doors to get around. If you're snarky, then I know what you're thinking, that this is just teleportation with extra steps. And yes, you're mostly right, but that ends up being more of a thematic similarity than a mechanical one, since it doesn't feel free and mobile like teleportation should, and how it will feel with the lizard holes. I'll gloss over the history here, but deck building is now a feature, and I have implemented an aforementioned system that allows you to add specific cards to your deck based on the lands that you choose. These door cards are the first real lands with effects added to the game, and based on which of the current 3 you choose, will put cards into your deck that potentially synergize with them. Cards that you can get from lands can't be put into your deck normally, and I plan on having some extra powerful lands actually put mediocre cards into your deck, so you have to weigh your options strategically. Not to mention, if you pick too many lands that put cards into your deck, you might bloat your deck in general. It's also possible that cards added this way are going to be the only cards you can have multiples of in your deck. I'm going to give this type of card a placeholder name for now, and just call them out cards. The big main out card for the doors is the Ding Dong Ditcher here. Isn't he cute with his long doorbell ringing finger? 2 of them will get added to your deck from the Door Village land card, and while not essential, they have a very simple ability which lets them floop to place a door in its or an adjacent land, so having a bunch of these troublemakers in your deck certainly doesn't hurt. In general, I've tried to make the cards of this element synergize in ways that makes them less effective the fewer of them you have in your deck, because you can actually mix elements in your deck building based on the lands that you choose. Having the cards rely on each other strategically means that unless you have a really creative deck, having 3 or 4 different elements won't be easy to pull off effectively. Instead of just talking design theory, let me introduce you to some of the cards and how they build on one another. Let's start with the Ding Dong Ditcher. This creature lets you easily place doors even in your opponent's kingdom. The Door Village itself's passive is that whenever you place a door, you can place it in the village instead, so it gives your door placing abilities even more reach. Then, through the Door Knight's ability, you can place it onto doors you control, so potentially into the enemy kingdom if you have doors there. And also, you can remove doors in your kingdom to move powerful cards like the Door Fairy into your opponent's kingdom, since it can't cross the divide on its own. There are cards like the Key Beast and Vault Door, which let you turn doors into vault things, which are creatures that turn back into doors on death, so you can turn your doors themselves into weapons and get them right back when they die. Aside from just doors though, there are also creatures that allow you to move things around, like the hinge butterfly, which lets you toss creatures over the divide, or the hinge mouth that lets you drag creatures along with its double movement. As I mentioned, there are big creatures like the key fairy and key beast, which benefit from this mobility, but there's also the dormitory structure, which allows you to make any of your creatures a 3/3 and gives them immobile. I learned from my previous mistakes in the playtest with cards that allow you to endlessly hide and buff creatures, so this structure can't cumulatively increase a creature's stats, just set it to a 3/3, so you can't even beef up mid-sized creatures into powerhouses either. I also tried to throw in some oddballs that still have some potential to work with the other cards, but are a bit more freeform, like the locksmith, who can make 2 adjacent lands be considered one single land for a turn, allowing the rules of adjacency to get all weird and wild, as well as extend the reach of your immobile creatures. There's a structure called the unfinished house, which lets you revive your destroyed doors into its land. Then if a door is destroyed there, you can turn the house into a finished house, which has the power to take the ding dong ditchers from your discard pile and play them back onto the board, which is incredibly powerful, but only if you have a bunch of ding dong ditchers in your deck. One of the lands is the Door Forest, which allows your creatures to cross into the adjacent enemy land without having to exhaust from crossing the Kingdom Divide like they normally do. The land also adds a stone archway to your deck, which makes all lands adjacent to the one that it's in. This way, you can place a stone archway in the Door Forest, and then when you're in it, you can freely enter any enemy land so long as there are no creatures there. It definitely synergizes with the doors, but like some of these cards, it also has a lot of potential to be useful in mixed element decks. There are also some even more out there oddballs that really don't care about the other door cards at all, since if everything is two-hand curated, there won't be a lot of room for creative expression or reason to mix elements. An example of this is the Warped Door Tower. When you cast a spell that exclusively targets its land or something on it, you may cast it a second time targeting anywhere else. It's a bit situational, but its general power is pretty obvious. I love making wild cards like this, but I am a bit worried it'll be way too easy to put 2 elements together that will account for each other's weaknesses. But I suppose all that means is you'll just have to build an even crazier deck than your opponent. By the way, if you want access to our next playtest 1 week early, developer live streams, and sneak peek teasers, or just want to support us in general, please consider becoming a member. Thanks so much for making this possible. We tested mirror matches of this deck, and it was pretty awesome. It still needs touch-ups and, like all things, rigorous testing, but it felt like real strategy had truly been introduced, and the base game mechanics held up completely to all of it. There was this real sense of advantage when you had a bunch of doors out on the field, because of all the things you could do with them and all the abilities that played off of them. I've only made enough cards so far to fill a single deck of around 20 cards, but the intent for each element is 40 cards each, so now that I have a really tightly woven main deck, I think I'll try to add more spicy curveballs to the rest of the set. I've never made a card game before, and I'm not even particularly good at them, so my sense for balancing is genuinely terrible, but that's what time and friends who play way more card games are for. The plan now is to start fleshing out the other 3 starting elements: corn, lizard holes, and crystals. I'll probably do corn or crystals next, whichever I decide will be the best matchup for doors. Then I can balance the 2 decks against each other and use those as a benchmark going forwards for all balancing. The game has got to be just crazy enough that it doesn't lose the wild emergent gameplay from the playtest without becoming overcomplicated, slow, and impossible to follow. As I already said, Lizard Holes is going to focus on teleporting and swapping, which is why I don't want it to be the next element deck I do. I'd like a bit more contrast in the matchup between doors and whatever comes next. Corn will focus on aggressive play and power units which derive strength from the lands and each other. There will have to be ways for the opponents to stifle that power, but it will be a pretty straightforward element that new players could use. Crystals will probably center around abilities that trigger when its creatures are destroyed, like shattering into smaller creatures or dealing damage to the attacker. But, you know, more creative than that. I'll probably include more prerequisites too, like an on-death ability that only triggers when they're on enemy land or something, because then the opponent can potentially work around it, instead of just being forced to bite the bullet over and over again. To be honest, making and balancing 16 unique elements is pretty daunting. There could be card combinations or even entire matchups that make the game fall apart completely. But fighting games can pull it off with their number of characters, I suppose, so I'll just have to do that too. Eventually, the development process will get through all of the boring revisions and end up almost entirely focused on creating cards and balancing, but it's hard to tell how far away that is from now. Still, in the short term, you can look forwards to other videos which cover the next 3 elements. Subscribing is for free. You can never take it back though. When you subscribe, the metadata gives me your IP address. If you unsubscribe, I have bots that will overheat your device until its insides melt. Thanks for watching!